I never thought I'd become the kind of person who'd end up on the local news for cutting a zipline mid-flight, especially not one rigged by a woman who had introduced herself to me with a casserole and a condescending smile. But here we are. Let's rewind a little before the splash and the screams, back to when I first met Karen, the newly minted president of our freshly formed Neighborhood Alliance, which was, in all but name, a glorified HOA trying to muscle its way into the lives of people who lived off-grid, off-pavement, and off-script like me. I'd moved to rural Montana to get away from bureaucracy and self-important busybodies, to live simply with my 2 dogs, my solar rig, and a patch of land passed down from my grandfather, who had homesteaded this stretch of wild pine and granite, outcroppings back when you could still stake a claim with a fence and a prayer. But as the years passed and the real estate market began to churn, the edges of my sanctuary started to fray. Newcomers moving in with their oversized trucks, undersized patients, and a constant need to improve things that didn't need fixing. And chief among them was Karen, a self-proclaimed outdoor enthusiast with no understanding of terrain, trespassing laws or tact, who decided, without consulting me or any zoning authorities, to string a zip line across her property and, here's the kicker, across mine, citing some obscure and completely incorrect belief that because her property touched the corner of mine near the creek bed, she had easement rights to airspace, which anyone with a lick of sense or a functioning internet connection knows is not how easements work, especially not in Montana where land rights are about as sacred as church. But Karen was not deterred by facts or fences, and after I caught her hired crew hammering poles into my hillside one Friday afternoon, I marched down there boots crunching. Gravel, my dog Brutus, growling low at my side, and asked, politely at first, what the hell they thought they were doing. The foreman, a wiry guy with a clipboard and a nervous twitch, said, "We were told this was all cleared with the owner." And when I told him I was the owner of the land his crew was desecrating with industrial-grade cabling, he paled, muttered something about miscommunication, and called Karen, who rolled up 5 minutes later in a sparkling white Jeep with decals that read, "Adventure starts here," which would have been ironic if it weren't so obnoxiously literal, because her idea of adventure seemed to be forcing everyone around her to live in her personal theme park of entitlement. And when I calmly informed her that she was trespassing and had no legal grounds to build a zip line through my property, she launched into a speech about community development, shared experiences, and how my land was perfect for the project, especially since I wasn't really using that section anyway, as if my lack of lawn chairs and tiki torches meant it was up for grabs. And when I reminded her that I didn't consent, that I wouldn't consent, and that I'd call the sheriff if her crew wasn't off my land by sundown, she gave me a saccharine smile and said, "We'll see about that," which I later found out meant she'd gone to the county office and tried to file a retroactive petition for recreational easement, an idiotic move that got her laughed out of the building by the clerk, but didn't stop her from stringing that damn cable anyway. I came home the next week to find the zip line fully installed, anchored at one end to a massive pine on her land, and the other to a reinforced A-frame drilled directly into the rock face on my hillside, complete with a platform, launch ramp, and a sign that read, "Flight Zone 1, hold tight," in bright cartoon lettering, and I just stood there for a long minute, trying to process the sheer audacity, my mind a whirlwind of fury, disbelief, and logistical curiosity. Because really, how did she pull this off without me noticing? And then I did what any landowner would do. I took photos, called my lawyer, and filed a formal complaint with the county. But of course, bureaucracy grinds slow, and Karen wasn't content to merely install the zip line. No, she had to use it, and not just on weekends, but every single afternoon, sometimes solo. Sometimes with guests whooping and hollering as they screamed overhead, the cable humming like a demented tuning fork as they zipped past my barn and over the creek. And it got worse when she installed floodlights and Bluetooth speakers at the top platform, turning dusk into a nightly rave of pop music and LED strobes that scared off deer, hawks, and sleep alike. And when I confronted her again, this time with documents and printouts and every legal argument I could muster, she laughed in my face and told me I should lighten up and embrace progress, claiming I'd become a grumpy old hermit. And maybe she was right about the hermit part, but not grumpy, at least not until a shrieking teenager on a test ride nearly hit one of my solar panels with their dangling legs, prompting me to call the sheriff again, who showed up, took statements, nodded sagely, but ultimately said it was a civil matter, which meant I had to take her to court if I wanted real action. So I did. I filed suit, paid the retainer, and prepared for what I thought would be a swift judgment in my favor. But Karen, slippery as an eel in a bucket of oil, delayed every step with continuances, countersuits, and a social media smear campaign that painted me as the villain, complete with drone footage, illegally captured, of course, of my property labeled undeveloped and ripe for fun, which only fueled the ire of the local Facebook moms who rallied behind her Kids Need Joy initiative. And I started getting weird stares at the feed store, half-whispered rumors at the diner, and more than a few prank calls telling me to let the kids fly. And it all came to a head on the 4th of July weekend, when Karen hosted what she called the Stars and Zips Festival, inviting half the town to her property for BBQ, fireworks, and non-stop zipline rides, which, naturally, spilled over onto my land despite my freshly posted no trespassing signs and orange construction tape. And that's when I'd had enough. When I saw the 50-foot drop over my own creek being used like a carnival ride, when I found beer cans in my fields and cigarette butts in my firewood pile, I decided I wasn't going to wait for court dates or hope for reason. I was going to end it myself, and that's when I hatched the plan. I'd waited until the party was in full swing, until Karen herself strapped into the harness with a GoPro on her helmet and a crowd of cheering neighbors below, and I made my way up the hill with a pair of industrial bolt cutters, quiet as a shadow, adrenaline thumping in my veins, Brutus trotting beside me with a low, eager growl, and I waited. Timed it perfectly so that she was midway across the line, suspended like a smug little comet over my property, and I cut it, not all at once, but a partial slice that frayed the cable just enough to snap under her weight a few seconds later, sending her tumbling into the pool she'd inflated below, just in case, which broke her fall but not her pride, and as she splashed and flailed and screamed bloody murder, the crowd gasped, some laughed, some screamed, and I stood there, bolt cutters in hand, watching karma cannonball into her inflatable kingdom, and of course the fallout was spectacular. The sheriff came, again, this time with more deputies. Karen threatened charges, again, but now I had footage too, plus documentation. And the cherry on top was that her illegal zipline and all its anchors had damaged my land, which the court finally acknowledged, resulting in a hefty fine, a cease and desist order, and the full dismantling of her flight zone. And while she still lives up the hill, I haven't seen her strapping into anything lately, though she did put her house up for sale last month, and rumor has it she's moving to Arizona, where I hope the HOA is everything she ever dreamed of. Because here in Montana, we still believe in boundaries, gravity, and consequences. After the zip line snapped and Karen was launched into her gaudy, inflatable pool like a squawking rubber chicken, I figured the worst was behind me. But if there's one thing I've learned about people like her, it's that humiliation doesn't humble them. It fuels them, festers inside them like a wasp hive until they come buzzing back, angrier and more irrational than before, and sure enough, even with the court order in my favor and her ridiculous flight zone dismantled by peace under county supervision, Karen was far from done with me. Within a week, she was back at the edge of my property, arms crossed, sunglasses on, clipboard in hand like some kind of suburban general surveying a battlefield she refused to concede. And that's when she unveiled her next plan. Not a zip line, this time, but what she called a community nature path, which, according to her hand-drawn, crayon-colored map, would meander from her backyard, through the pine grove on my land, across the creek, and loop back via an old logging trail that hadn't been used since the 70s. And when I asked her, incredulously, if she'd actually read the cease and desist order, she said. And I quote, "It doesn't say anything about walking paths." As if violating private property was somehow less illegal if you were doing it in hiking boots instead of a harness. And that's when I realized I wasn't dealing with mere entitlement anymore. I was dealing with obsession, a woman so fixated on expanding her influence, her image, and her perceived authority that she was willing to rewrite reality to fit her delusions. And this time she wasn't alone, because during her post-Zipline campaign to repair her social standing, she'd assembled a kind of ragtag neighborhood council made up of the least informed but most vocal transplants in the area. Ted, who moved here from Portland and thinks every fire pit should be regulated. Denise, who once tried to rescue a mule deer by feeding it Doritos. And Bruce, a self-described eco-warrior who drives a lifted diesel truck and leaves his Christmas lights up year-round, and together they began petitioning the county for funding to develop shared-use recreational corridors, a mouthful of nonsense that basically meant carving walking trails through land they didn't own. And while the county was smarter this time, more cautious after the Zipline incident, they still sent out an inspector to evaluate potential easement conflicts, which was how I found myself escorting a very polite but clearly uncomfortable government man through my creek bed while Brutus growled and the inspector nervously tapped away on a tablet, snapping photos of flagged trees that Karen and her crew had tied ribbons around like they were about to host a kindergarten field trip. And I explained again that this was private land, deeded and registered since 1922, with no public access, granted and no easements filed, and the inspector nodded, made notes, and promised to file a thorough report, but that didn't stop Karen from continuing to push, first with pamphlets slipped into mailboxes promising natural renewal through shared paths, then with an op-ed in the local paper titled "One Man's Land is a Community's Loss," which featured a blurry photo of my property labeled Underutilized Forest Zone. And by now, I was getting real tired of being labeled anything. By a woman who thought squirrels were vermin and once tried to organize a skunk relocation project. So I fought back, not with bolt cutters this time, but with facts, filing a formal complaint for harassment and unauthorized land survey, complete. With time-stamped trail cam footage of Karen and Bruce wandering onto my property with yardsticks and a wheeled measuring thing, muttering about line of sight and natural grade, and that finally got the sheriff's department involved in a real way, issuing Karen a formal trespass warning and citing her for unpermitted surveying. But even that didn't stop her because within days she pivoted again, this time hosting what she called Forest Fellowship Walks, where she and her cronies would gather at the edge of her property and loudly commune with nature in my direction, reading poetry, banging on drums, and chanting about open-air equity, which would have been laughable if it weren't so persistently irritating, especially when one of her guests, who I later found out was a social media influencer named Nature Tammy, wandered across my fence line and started live streaming herself hugging my trees, prompting me to come out with my chainsaw. Not running, just cradled casually in my arms, which got her to run back to Karen's with tears in her eyes and 3 million TikTok views in her pocket. And that's when the internet caught wind of it again, with hashtags like Dacher Let the Trees Be Free and Dash Mountain Man Menace circulating among people who couldn't point to Montana on a map, and I started getting hate mail, actual, physical hate mail, from people demanding I stop hoarding nature, which would have been hilarious if it weren't so surreal. And through it all, Karen kept escalating, insisting in interviews and HOA meetings that I was stonewalling community growth and holding the forest hostage, as if I had a bunch of trees tied to stakes and begging for liberation. And the final straw came when I caught her trying to build a literal footbridge across my creek, using lumber she'd stashed behind a boulder on my side of the property line. And when I confronted her, she had the audacity to claim it was a gift to foster goodwill, and that I was welcome to use it too. And that's when I lost it. Not yelling, not threatening, just ice-cold calm as I told her if she so much as laid a twig on my land again, I'd not only take her back to court, I'd press for damages, back charges and criminal trespass, and that if her little council of busybodies wanted a shared experience, they could experience my lawyer, my boundary markers, and my absolute refusal to be bulldozed by suburban entitlement dressed up as community spirit. And for a moment she actually looked rattled, just a flicker of it. But then she smirked, muttered, "We'll see," and turned back toward her property, leaving me to spend the next week patrolling my land like a park ranger with PTSD, installing more cameras, reinforcing my fences, and making sure there were no more surprise amenities cropping up behind trees. But what I didn't know was that Karen had one more trick up her sleeve, a desperate move born of a cocktail of ego, revenge, and misguided ambition, and it would arrive in the form of an unauthorized family adventure race that would include over 50 participants, 5 checkpoints, and one very familiar zipline. Rebuilt in secret over the course of 2 nights by volunteers, she lured in from a regional Facebook group offering free thrills and nature bonding. And she'd hidden the launch point further up the ridge just past the county line, threading the cable through a patch of dense firs and anchoring the landing platform directly above my lower meadow. And the only reason I found out was because my neighbor Hank, who's about as anti-Karen as a man can be without getting sued, spotted the lights one night while stargazing and called me in a whisper like he'd just seen aliens. And sure enough, when I went to investigate the next day, I found tracks, cables, and a fresh platform, all clearly on my land, all clearly violating the court order. And that's when I realized this wasn't just Karen being Karen. This was war, and I was going to have to end it once and for all, not with force, not with fire, but with the kind of ironclad, bulletproof takedown that even the most delusional HOA president couldn't weasel out of. And that's when I called in a favor from my cousin Jake, who works in environmental compliance and happened to know just the right combination of words to get a state inspector to visit on short notice, and together we documented every violation: illegal construction, unpermitted land use, endangered, plant disruption, even creek water diversion for a makeshift splash pool, and we sent it off in a thick packet labeled urgent, and while we waited for the wheels to turn, I prepared my land for the coming storm. Because I knew Karen wasn't going to stop until either I broke or she did, and I wasn't planning on being the one who broke. When the 3rd round of inspection paperwork went through and the state finally opened a formal case against Karen for violating multiple environmental codes, ranging from unpermitted land alteration to illegally disturbing riparian buffer zones, I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd retreat into that gaudy faux rustic cabin of hers and stew quietly in defeat. But instead, she tripled down like someone whose HOA title came with a cape and a scepter, parading around like Queen of the Pines with clipboards, camera drones, and a rotating cast of social media eco-influencers who came in droves to witness the so-called green injustice. All while I was stuck playing warden of my own land, constantly fending off strangers who thought they had the right to hike, picnic, or zip line through my property like it was some neglected public park waiting to be revitalized by the benevolent hand of Karen and her fellowship of the self-righteous. And while the legal wheels ground slowly, burdened by layers of bureaucracy and Karen's endless appeals, my real battle became day-to-day survival, waking up every morning to new offenses, a mysteriously missing trail cam, a pile of granola, bar wrappers by the creek, boot prints in the garden I'd just planted, and once, absurdly, a laminated sign zip-tied to one of my trees that read, "Community Meditation Zone. Breathe with nature, not against it," which I tore down and burned on the spot. And I began keeping a full-time journal of incidents, photos, GPS data, timestamps, even Brutus's barking patterns, turning my farmhouse into a kind of anti-Karen war room covered in maps and sticky notes. Because I knew the real victory wouldn't come through shouting or confrontation. It would come through airtight documentation, methodical strategy, and sheer unshakable stubbornness, which, lucky for me, runs in my blood deeper than the creek that winds through our family land. Meanwhile, Karen was staging her most audacious public play yet, a fundraising event she dubbed the Wilderness Reconnection Gala, where she planned to host a wine and cheese walkathon, on my land no less, to reclaim open space for all, complete with live acoustic music, artisan charcuterie, and guided spiritual grounding sessions. And she even went so far as to advertise the event with posters in town, social media flyers, and a press release sent to the local paper, which they ran, by the way, with the headline, "Community. Hero builds bridges, literally." And when I contacted the reporter to explain that the bridge was illegally built and currently stored in pieces in my woodshed after I dismantled it, they said, "That's not the story we were told." And I knew then that public perception had become Karen's greatest weapon, twisting facts with a smile and a hashtag while I was left cleaning up after her fantasies. But I wasn't going to let her win, not now, not after everything she'd done, not just to me, but to the land itself, which she'd trampled with the reckless zeal of someone who sees nature not as something to protect, but as a backdrop for content creation and curated experiences. So I doubled down too, contacting every relevant department: environmental, protection, county planning, zoning enforcement, the fire marshal, and filing comprehensive complaints supported by the mountain of evidence I'd gathered over the past year, and one by one, the dominoes began to fall. A cease and desist order for unauthorized construction, a hefty fine for water redirection, and a final notice of investigation from the State Attorney General's office after I uncovered that she'd falsified the boundary map submitted with her initial easement petition, a map that magically shrunk my property lines by over 200 feet and included a digitally added public access corridor that didn't exist, which was not just delusional, but borderline criminal, and I made sure every agency involved knew it. But even as the legal noose tightened, Karen kept up appearances, welcoming guests with faux spiritual bravado, guiding tours along the edge of my now heavily marked boundary line with tales of how the land wants to be shared, until finally, the gala day arrived, and I woke up before sunrise with a pit in my stomach and a thermos of black coffee, having prepped my entire property with printed warnings, new fences, camera coverage, and one final surprise: a temporary but fully legal electric livestock fence stretched across the narrow clearing where the illegal zipline had once flown, complete with warning signs in 3 languages and a permit posted on a wooden stake, completely above board but deeply inconvenient for anyone planning to traipse across my land in designer hiking boots while sipping Pinot Noir. And just as I expected, around 10 a.m., the first of Karen's guests began to arrive, spilling out of their cars with selfie sticks and paper maps, led by Karen herself in a flowing forest green caftan and a headset microphone, greeting them with phrases like "Welcome, Earthkin," and "Let the pine spirits guide you," while I watched from the edge of my porch with Brutus at my side, the calm before the storm crackling in the air like the start of a thunderhead, and sure enough, about 20 minutes into her walking, "Tour!" I heard the first yelp as someone touched the fence, followed by a panicked murmur through the group, and Karen running forward, flailing her arms and demanding answers, only to come face to face with the posted permits and a sheriff's deputy who'd agreed to oversee the day in case of escalation, and when he calmly explained that the fence was legal, necessary for livestock control, never mind that I didn't currently have any goats, and not to be tampered with, Karen's face turned the color of beetroot wine, and she tried to rally the group with a screed about abuse of power until a second deputy stepped in and warned her she was dangerously close to violating her probationary trespass agreement. And that's when it started to unravel. Her followers started asking questions, backing away, checking their phones, realizing maybe they weren't on the side of the Earth Goddess after all, especially when I walked down with a binder full of printed evidence and handed it off to a local reporter who'd finally come to hear my side, and from there, the story flipped faster than a flapjack on a hot griddle, with headlines like, "Landowner fights back," and "Karen's green grab unravels," replacing the earlier puff pieces. And the final blow came 2 weeks later when a formal lawsuit was filed against her by the Montana Department of Environmental Quality for ecological disruption, potential fraud, and multiple zoning code violations, leading to a public hearing, where, for the first time, Karen had to sit and listen while experts dismantled every lie she'd constructed. Every fake permit, every overreach, and I sat in the back of that courtroom in my cleanest flannel, arms crossed, watching as the woman who'd turned my peaceful life into a year-long farce of zip lines, drum circles, and delusion finally faced the consequences of her unchecked crusade for control. The court ordered her to pay nearly $80,000 in fines and restitution, including mandatory restoration of the damaged creek bed and removal of all remaining foreign objects from my property, and while she tried to appeal, the tide had turned against her influence collapsing like a paper teepee in the rain, and as the cleanup crews came, supervised by state contractors and paid for out of her own pocket, I watched from the ridge, sipping my coffee as the last of her nature installations were dismantled, the fake meditation rock path hauled away, the zipline anchor poles chopped down and burned in a pile far from my property line, and I felt, for the first time in months, something like peace return to the land, the wind through the pines no longer competing with Bluetooth speakers, or amateur ukulele sessions, just silence, birdsong, and the rustle of leaves where people no longer trespassed. She didn't show her face again after that, at least not around me. Her property went dark, the gaudy Jeep sat unmoved for weeks, and then one day a for sale sign appeared out front, nailed sloppily to a birch tree, and word around town was that she'd gone back to California, or maybe Arizona, or wherever HOA presidents go when their imaginary kingdoms collapse. And while I'll never get back the time, energy, or peace she stole from me, I did get back my land. Every inch of it, every tree, every stone, every square foot of sky above it, and that was worth everything. In the months following Karen's retreat and the sale of her absurdly oversized mountain cabin, the land finally began to heal, not just the soil and the torn-up creek bed, but me too, in a way I didn't fully realize I needed until the last of her spiritual rock circles was cleared away, and silence returned to my woods like a long-lost friend walking through the front door without knocking. And though there was still debris to clean and paths to block and a dozen trail cams to check every morning like a paranoid ranger, I could finally sip my morning coffee without wondering whether some hemp-wrapped hiker was going to emerge from the tree line quoting Thoreau and asking for permission to harmonize. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I began reclaiming the rhythm I'd lost. A rhythm that sounded like the buzz of cicadas, the distant hum of Brutus's collar bell, the low gurgle of the creek flowing where it should, and the steady click of my boots over soil that no longer felt violated. And yet, despite her absence, Karen still lingered like the faint echo of an obnoxious ringtone, because people like her don't just vanish, they leave residue. Misinformed. Neighbors still quoting her nature-sharing doctrine, old drone footage circulating online, and worst of all, that damn article from the early days of her campaign still sitting on Google, misleading out-of-towners into thinking my private acreage is some kind of open-air museum of enlightenment. So when a couple of college kids from Bozeman showed up one afternoon asking if they could film a short documentary about eco-spiritual rewilding on communal lands, I politely directed them to the road. Then spent the evening writing a letter to the newspaper editor detailing every step of the legal case and attaching 27 pages of documentation and photos, which they eventually published as a full feature under the headline, "My Land, Her Fantasy, A Montana Rancher Speaks." It went semi-viral, and for a glorious week, the inbox that once overflowed with "Jarf Free the Forest" hate mail now swelled with messages of support, apology, and the occasional offer to buy me a drink or ship me homemade beef jerky, but more than anything, what I got was something I didn't expect. Validation. Not from the county, not from the state, not even from the courts, but from the people who saw through the facade and recognized what this fight was really about. Ownership, boundaries, the difference between stewardship and self-importance. And I began to understand that what Karen had tried to take from me wasn't just land, but identity, dignity, the quiet pride of knowing where your fence posts sit and why they matter. And so I kept telling the story whenever someone asked, whenever some kid on a bike paused by the mailbox and said, "Hey, you're the Zipline guy, right?" I told them the truth, not the internet version, not the TikTok cut with dramatic music, but the long, gritty, boots-on-the-ground truth about how one woman's delusion nearly bulldozed a century of legacy, and how one man, one stubborn, mule-hearted man, stopped her not with violence or vengeance, but with patience, paperwork, and enough trail cam footage to qualify for his own streaming series, and life, as it tends to do after the storms pass, slowly settled into its old shape. With the occasional addition, I finally built the barn extension I'd been putting off. I let Hank teach me how to make his infamous smoked jalapeno jerky. I started a side gig selling handmade cedar birdhouses, thanks to all the salvaged wood, from Karen's spiritual installations. And I even let a local conservation group use my north plot to study fox migrations, with written contracts, of course. But just when I thought it was over, when the last Karen-related tremor had faded into memory, I got a call from a real estate agent in Billings who'd just taken over the listing for Karen's former property, and she wanted to warn me that the buyers, city couple from Seattle, mid-30s, into permaculture and minimalist living, were asking a lot of questions about land access and intentional community zones, and my stomach sank because I knew that tone, I knew that language, and I wasn't about to fight this battle all over again, not after everything, so I did what any rational man would do. I got ahead of it, reached out personally, invited them over for coffee and a tour, and laid it all out. Every inch of boundary, every legal ruling, every past trespass. And by the time I was done, their enthusiasm had cooled to a polite, cautious interest, and they ultimately backed out, which suited me just fine, and the place sat empty for a while longer, growing weeds and dust and losing value until, at last, it was bought by an older couple from Wyoming who just wanted to fly fish and be left alone, my kind of people. And from then on, peace was no longer something I had to fight for. It just existed, like the stars or the pine needles or the scratchy wool of my favorite winter socks, and one crisp October morning, while hiking the old trail that winds along the ridge above. The creek. I paused at the place where the original zipline had been anchored, the tree still scarred, bark lighter where the cable once dug deep, and I ran my hand over the spot. Not angry, not bitter, just thoughtful. And I realized something I hadn't before. The land forgives, in its own way, slowly, patiently, like water smoothing stone, and if the land could forgive Karen, then maybe I could too, not for her sake, but for mine, because hate, like obsession, eats up good soil and leaves it barren, and I wasn't about to give her even one more inch, not in spirit, not in memory. So I said a quiet goodbye to the ghost of her foolish zipline and kept walking. Deeper into the forest I knew like my own heartbeat, and though I sometimes still see faint reminders of her, a broken ribbon tied around a sapling, a long-forgotten forest fellowship sign warped by rain and time, they no longer sting. They're just part of the land's story now. And mine, a reminder that even out here in the open wild, peace isn't something given. It's something you claim, protect, and hold, inch by inch, acre by acre, no matter how many Karens come flying through the sky.